Welcome to Trojan Family Weekend 2020. This is not the way we usually do our Dean's reception. Usually we're allowed to offer you coffee and orange juice and a delicious breakfast spread, and we can chat over muffins and cake. I'm sorry that we can't do that this time. We would love to be able to, and as soon as it's safe, we will. And for those of you who I have not yet had the chance to meet, I very much look forward to doing that. Because we can't do that this year, though, we thought we would do something a little bit different and offer you a peek under the hood at one of our new emerging signature initiatives and let you meet 4 of our spectacular faculty and hear from them some of the things they're working on, specifically in the area of sustainability. So just by way of introduction, research universities are places where experts across a very wide range of disciplines come together and work on some of the hardest problems that are out there. And this very timely and difficult and important topic of climate change and sustainability is obviously one that most, if not all, of our universities are thinking about in one form or another. And one of the challenges we have really dug into is the question of what are others not doing? Where are the gaps? And how can we get serious about building an initiative that really does something that's a little bit different from what others around the nation and around the world are doing? And if you're paying attention to other universities, you're probably seeing the development of energy centers, new technology, new science, new batteries, new solar cells. That's all terrific. We have a great program here in that area too. But today I want to just give you a little bit of a look at something different. And that different thing is we are really building a new way of bringing out of the woodwork and getting people working together in the areas of economics and politics, political science, psychology, decision theory, and really trying to help think through, how do we work on this really intractable, difficult problem, not in terms of just building new science and technology, but in terms of getting people to work together and think about it in different ways. So that's the subject of the panel today. So rather than hear more from me, I'd like to have each of our panelists introduce themselves to you and just say a little bit about their background and what they're interested in. And then we'll dive into conversation and we'll hear a little bit about some of the things we at Dornsife are doing that I'm excited about that I think are a little different. So maybe we could start with Professor Joe Arbery. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Amber, and welcome everyone. I'm Joe Arbery. I am the director of the Wrigley Institute for Environmental Studies here at USC. In addition to that, I'm a professor in the psychology department, the Dana and David Dornsife Professor of Psychology. My background originally actually was in oceanography, and my first job out of oceanography was in looking at how to make science more relevant in the decisions being made by business leaders and policymakers. And one of the first lessons I learned is that it was very difficult to get people to take the science seriously. And I got so frustrated with it that I did what a lot of folks do, and that is I went back to school and did my PhD at the intersection between psychology and economics, really focused in on the idea of decision-making and decision theory, trying to understand what it is about how people process information and make decisions, specifically with an eye toward how we can improve their decision-making capabilities, especially as it relates to sustainability and the environment. So I am completely delighted to be a part of the Dornsife and USC family at the Wrigley Institute.
Thank you. Let's move to Professor Wendy Bruin de Bruin.
Hi. I am a provost professor in public policy, psychology, and behavioral science. That's a lot of words behind my title, and it basically means that I am looking at how, from the insights from public policy and psychology and behavioral science, how we can improve climate communications, because we have good climate science that suggests that climate change is happening and what potential solutions might be. But if people are not on board in terms of wanting to implement these policies or changing their behavior, then things might not happen. And so my work includes a project led by the Dornsife Public Exchange and with the United Nations that tries to improve climate communications, such as the ones produced by the IPCC. And if you've seen the reports that come out of climate institutions, they're often very complicated, using expert jargon, and it's not just climate scientists that do that, experts in other domains do that too. And so I'm working with them to see how people understand climate terminology and see if we can come up with simpler wording that is more intuitive to people, so that they're more, it's easier for policymakers, practitioners, and members of the general public to digest information about climate change.
That's terrific. Thank you. I want to come back to that and have you give us some insight into the kinds of things that work and don't work. But let's move on, and Professor Matthew Kahn.
Amber, thank you for inviting me. Folks, I'm a microeconomist, and back to supply and demand, which I hope was some of the highlights of your life. It's been a highlight of my life. But taking that old model that we use, but bringing it to the very important topic of climate change economics. How do we shrink our carbon footprint? Given that we face the challenge of climate change, how can we incentivize capitalism to step up? In this age of big data, how can academics help the community to adapt to these challenges we face? So I'm working with some other economists at USC Economics, trying to recenter the economic approach, but focused on this key climate change issue.
Terrific, thank you. And last but not least, Professor Jill Sohm.
Thanks, Amber. I'm the director of the Environmental Studies program, which is an undergraduate education program. So that's really where my focus is at. I'm actually an oceanographer by training, so that's really interesting to hear about you, Joe. I didn't know that. And a microbial ecologist, but I work now on using that expertise to teach classes on water, coastal processes, ecology, microbes, and things relating to that. The other thing that I'm working on right now is moving sustainability into other classes across campus, and working on a program to get sustainability incorporated into a broad range of general education classes.
Thank you. So I know a lot of parents are joining us and listening, and we'll try to keep pointing out all of the ways in which this cutting edge research that we're talking about is built into your kids' education. And it's not just in the classroom, it's in co-curricular activities, it's in experiential learning programs. And we'll try to point it out as we go along. But we'll also come back to the end and make sure that Jill jumps in throughout and says, hey, don't forget, here's a place where your kids are very involved. But I think we will all try to point that out as we're talking. So let's open up by turning back to Joe and just ask, so Joe is brand new. In fact, he hasn't quite formally landed in Los Angeles yet. We've just recruited him away from the University of Michigan, where he was running the Herb Center. He is our new director of the Wrigley Institute for Environmental Studies. I am super excited to have him here because it's been a big goal of mine to really expand the vision of this institute. It is a terrific institute. We have this absolutely spectacular, beautiful marine science research station out on Catalina Island. And the Institute's really been focused largely on marine science and on education and outreach. We're not letting any of that go, but we're going to really expand the mission of the Institute. And Joe, can you just talk a little bit about some of the things you have in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the things that my wonderful colleagues just shared really exemplify where we want to go as an institute over the next several years. So Jill talked about the importance of building understanding about systems. Matthew was talking about big data and economics and how can we incentivize behavior. Wendy was talking about communications and getting people to change their behaviors. And of course, I come at things from a very similar perspective around decision-making. Really where Wrigley has excelled is in helping people to think about solutions to environmental challenges. But as you said, Amber, largely from a marine science standpoint. Our big challenge going forward now is how do we connect the pieces that my colleagues just talked about such that the Wrigley Institute maintains its legacy and really terrific work on coastal systems, but expands that to the big environmental challenges and sustainability challenges facing not only California, but the entire country and the rest of the world. So as we look at California, on this very day, we have wildfires. As we pivot around the country, we're talking about big storms. As we move to another part of the country, which includes California, we're talking about coastal erosion and sea level rise. We're talking about environmental justice. These are all interconnected issues, all of which demand a systems level approach to finding solutions. So in the Wrigley that I hope to lead over the next 5 years or more, if you let me, is to really focus on how we can connect Wrigley to a broader array of sustainability challenges around the world, how we can do a much better job of connecting the natural sciences with the social and behavioral sciences so that we provide a very complete picture of not only the kinds of challenges we face, but the solutions that we can deploy to address them. And that's really, I think, what's most exciting about where Wrigley is going to go. There's no shortage of commentary out in the world right now talking to us about how bad the sustainability or environmental challenges are. And there's no shortage of people out there who will tell us what the solution ought to be. But there's a real disconnect between those two things in terms of how do we actually mobilize our understanding to make better decisions, to change individual behaviors at the household level, and ultimately, if we can, to modify state and federal policy as it relates to things like, Amber, you said, climate change. So Wrigley has a really important role to play, and I can't be happier to be in the kind of driver's seat as we put these pieces together and get them to work for USC, for California, and for everyone in this country.
So one of the things that made Joe really stand above everybody, so many of the other people we had come in and talk to us about vision, was he's just an incredibly collaborative guy. And, you know, Wendy is appointed primarily in the Price School, and then she shares an appointment also in Dornsife in the psychology department. Can you guys talk a little bit about how do you see interactions between schools, and, you know, how can we reach out beyond Dornsife and really collaborate across the university?
I think that with big problems such as climate change, it is the case, and other big problems that are facing the world as well, it is increasingly the case that you just can't solve that problem by looking at it from one single discipline. And so I think what is nice about USC is that we have expertise relevant to understanding climate change and doing something about it, and people in different disciplines who can contribute to solving that problem from not just from a scientific perspective, but also from a technological perspective and a human perspective. Joe, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I agree with everything that Wendy just said. You know, I think universities, R1 universities, really ought to exemplify the old sort of adage that you can be greater as a whole than you can be by just adding up your individual parts. And I think we all know as academics that not all universities succeed when it comes to that adage. I think USC is uniquely poised to actually be successful in this space for the same reasons that Wendy pointed out. Not only do you need multiple disciplines to address these kinds of problems, but you need a willingness on the part of the disciplines within an institution like USC to actually want to come together and to do it collaboratively. And I think the walls are very low at USC that foster that kind of collaboration. So between Wrigley and Dornsife, but then Price, you know, there's all kinds of opportunities for us to work together. And just as sort of a side anecdote, since Wendy, you said something nice about me, Wendy and I have been sort of circling each other as colleagues since about 2009 and almost landed at the same institution on 2 separate occasions. So the fact that we finally get to work together at USC is a bit of a dream come true for me.
It's good to have
and
you
you're in the
Joe.
same department. It's terrific. Yeah. So I want to bring Matt back in the conversation. Matt, you have been a big proponent of this kind of cross-university collaboration and cross-school collaboration, and you really lead a nascent environmental economics program that we are excited about building on. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing there, and how you see building that program?
So Amber, you have given us the opportunity to build an excellent environmental economics group. And so I'm the old guy in the group. There are 3 tenured faculty members, the vice chair of USC Econ, Paulina Oliva, who is an expert on environmental economics and development economics. So Paulina is doing really exciting work on air pollution in Mexico, of how skill formation, women's labor force participation, and the learning capacity of children exposed to pollution in Mexico City. She's doing very exciting work. Our new colleague, Rob Metcalf, runs field experiments. Field experiments is this new methodology for which the Nobel Prize in Economics was last year given to Esther Duflo, Michael Kramer, and Abhijit Banerjee. Rob just published a field experiment paper where he worked with Virgin Airlines pilots and nudged them to fly more slowly. When they flew their airplanes quick across continents, they had a huge environmental carbon footprint. By slowing down these pilots, this had a win-win of saving the company money and reducing the carbon footprint. So this is slight freakonomics, but I think it's very exciting, and there's really good synergies between Paulina, Rob, and I, and we think that USC Econ is going to become a center of training young environmental economists, and I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, I'm excited about it too. And I want to bring Jill back in. Jill runs the Environmental Studies program, which is really a unique and interesting program, and one that we're interested in expanding. Can you talk a little bit about this program? And, you know, it's not an environmental science program, but it has science. It's not an environmental social science program, but it has that. You know, to talk a little bit about how that articulates also with Wrigley, because I know that these programs are very closely connected.
Yeah, so the program is interdisciplinary, which is why we're a program and not a department. It sits at the interface of a bunch of different disciplines at the university, and that's because environmental problems sit at the interface of a whole bunch of different disciplines. And so what we're trying to do with our students is get them understanding of a whole bunch of different fields that come into play when you're trying to solve an environmental problem or a sustainability problem, so that they can sit at that interface and sort of talk across it and to people that are in different fields. So even if they don't want to be an environmental scientist, they need to be able to read the scientific papers, understand, interpret them, and use that information for making policy or management decisions or working in an NGO that might fill in gaps that the government isn't taking care of, for example. One of the things that we believe in really strongly, and I've been working on for a few years to expand, is more experiential learning for our students, because there's nothing better than them getting their hands on the problems themselves. And for a number of years, we've worked really closely with the Wrigley Institute for providing opportunities for our students. And in the form of research projects, internships, some of them, the students do grant writing. There's a lot of different things that that the Wrigley Institute has provided for our students, and we're really, really grateful for that. I'm really excited about the new expansion of direction, because it means that we're going to have more opportunity to serve a wider range of our students that have a wider range of interests. And I think also, you know, this idea of bringing together all these different disciplines for problem solving is going to be a great example for the students to learn from.
Yeah, so this is one of our bigger majors. How many do we have?
The last numbers says about 300 students, which is pretty great.
And where do some of them go when they graduate?
It is extremely variable. We have students that go to law school. We have some students that go to medical school, some that work in environmental NGOs, working for state, city, and local government in things like LA Sanitation or Cal EPA. Yeah, it really varies. Some leave environmental studies altogether, but that's all right.
Yeah, it's all good. I mean, it just gives them a lot more experience to go on as they leave. So I want to come back. Wendy, you said something about working with the UN. Tell people a little more about that project, and a little bit more about, you know, you said helping them understand how to use language in a way that's more effective. You have some background in that. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think it's true for academics in many fields that once we're trained in the specific fields, we've learned terminology to better express to our colleagues what we mean. And so we tend to use expert terminology that is important for the progression of the field. But then when talking to people who are not in our field, we often get stuck using those words without realizing that nobody else really uses those words. And that is true for climate scientists also. And so if you read reports from climate scientists, you'll come across terms like mitigation, adaptation, carbon neutral, sustainable development, which to climate scientists mean specific things. But we're finding that for members of the general public, these are not necessarily words that they are comfortable with. They may have heard them, they may have not heard them. In many cases, they have heard them, but they're still guessing at what those words might mean. And so if climate science is to be communicated effectively, it's important to try and move away from that expert terminology and use words that people actually understand. And so in patient communications in the health domain, communications have been studied more extensively than in the climate domain. And there what they have learned is that good communications should really be written at like a 6th or 7th grade reading level. And when experts hear that, they say, oh, I don't want to talk down to people. But the thing is, you're talking about science. It's not like you're writing a Sesame Street story or something. You're writing something really complicated. And the easier you make the wording that you describe the complicated topic in, the easier it will be for people to understand what you're trying to say. And so that is a skill that a lot of scientists don't have, and I come in to help them test their communications with their intended audience members to see how they interpret those communications, and then suggest alternative wording to improve it. And similarly, I've done work also with graphs, because experts often produce graphs that are very complicated, colorful, and beautiful, but not necessarily very easy to understand. And so I often help them to simplify their graphs to help them communicate their main message.
Economists never have that problem.
Some economists do, but I don't think Matthew does.
I'm kidding. I'm a physicist, so I know all about this problem.
I've done similar work with economists and central banks.
So just give us an example of, what are some of the kind of straight talk ways of framing some of these really important messages that you've been able to help these folks come up with?
Well, so we're still testing, we're still in the middle of this project. So I think it's too early to give you a recommendation from that project, but I'll give you another insight that climate scientists often find shocking. So in climate science, a lot of communications are still focused on trying to convince people that climate change is happening, because climate scientists are very concerned that people are not taking it seriously. And it is true that initially a lot of people were not taking it seriously, but current polls in the United States suggest that 73% of Americans are now concerned about climate change. So a majority is concerned, and part this is due, sadly, to more extreme weather events happening. People are taking it seriously now, or more people are taking it seriously now. But what I'm finding that when you talk to that motivated majority is that they don't actually necessarily know what to do about it. And so something I often refer to is that when I talk to families, it turns out that a lot of families are fighting about who left the lights on in the room, who was last in there and left the lights on, because that's a waste of energy and is bad for climate change. And the thing is, yeah, you should turn off the lights. That's a good idea. That will save energy, and it will be better for curbing climate change. But really, if you're concerned about energy use in the home, you should be worrying more about using your air conditioner less, because that is really the big user in the home. And similar, and even pro-environmental consumers, people who think of themselves as green, don't necessarily are still focusing on the lights rather than the air conditioner. And the same issue happens with food choices. So a lot of pro-environmental people worry about packaging and reducing that, and that's a good idea. But really, the biggest thing you can do in terms of your food choices is try to eat less meat.
This is a perfect segue to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is that these are issues that really act on all scales. So there is what can we as individuals do, there is what can we do as a city, and LA is just a great template city of one of these incredible megacities. And how can we as a university embedded here in Los Angeles have an impact? What can a state do? What can a nation do? And then what should the global community be doing? And I just want to talk a little bit about, you gave us a great introduction to what can we as individuals do. I just want to bring everyone else in. From your experience, from really a personal standpoint, what else should we all be doing to think about this in a better way?
You know what? I think the one thing we could be doing, Amber, and this isn't to be glib, but it's that we should be thinking about this in a better way. I think really that's what it comes down to. I think there's so many things we do as individuals, but also as society that are motivated by our desire to fit in, that are motivated by perhaps ways of thinking that aren't as active. Some researchers call the ways in which we process information quite lazy, that we react on impulse and emotion very sort of instinctively and intuitively, but a lot of the heavier cognitive lifting we need to do, the harder, the deeper thinking is just too hard, and we'd rather not turn that part of our mind on. So if there's one thing that we can do, both as a university teaching our students, but also as individuals who work with all kinds of folks, and I think about Dornsife being so involved in the community, it's to alert people to the fact that they really have a lot of agency, and the first sort of precursor step to being an active member of society when it comes to sustainability is to actually activate some deeper critical thinking. And this is where a program like Matthews in economics and the work that Wendy's doing, but certainly what Jill and her team are doing in ENST is so important. It doesn't just teach people about a system, but it teaches the people skills about how to think about systems. And I think that is so crucially important.
That is such an essential part of the Dornsife education, the idea that we're taking the liberal arts tradition and really bringing in a lot of very practical, very modern, very current kinds of elements and putting those two things together. And that's really our goal from the educational standpoint, is to get that right, to have this be the best liberal arts type education you can have in the country. Jill, you must talk to your students about this all the time. What do you think? What do you tell them?
Yeah, we face a lot of eco-depression and difficult feelings in our major, because we talk a lot about things that are sort of depressing. They feel like they weigh too much, like they're too difficult to move. And one of the things that I tell my students is just a place to start is to make sure that you're making decisions for yourself that you feel good about, like changing the way that you eat, or taking public transportation. And it may feel like it's small things, but it's true that a lot of people together taking collective action can make a difference. But in addition to that, I also try to really tell them that it's not right for individuals to feel like it's only on individuals, because we also have a government and corporations that contribute a really large amount to the sustainability problems that we face. And so I just try to remind them not to take it all on themselves and feel that guilt, like it's only on them to make the change for everything.
That's good advice. Matt, you're a microeconomist. Does it go all the way down to the individual micro? Talk to us a little bit about it.
It sure does. So Yannick, Amber, I'm remembering my student Yannick from 2 years ago, who came up to me and said, Professor Khan, I wish that USC had more solar panels on campus. How do I make the hardcore net present value pitch to these trustees and perhaps some non-greens? And we had a terrific 2-hour meeting on the upfront fixed costs of going green and the long-run reductions in operating costs, and also the carbon offset benefits. And it was terrific to work with an optimistic young Dornsife student and to take the algebra that he had learned in my boring classes, but to bring it to life about something he cared about. And so I walked away actually feeling a little better about myself and sort of as an educator. And and that's the type of experience that I really value at Dornsife, of when we dust off the usual economics formula, but our students are passionate about applying them and seeing how they connect to things that they care about, like the green economy at USC.
That's a great example. Let's zoom out a little bit. What about LA? What can we do? As a group, this is something I'm really passionate about. I've thought about it a lot in a bunch of different ways. Let's talk about it here. LA, USC in LA, in sustainability. Where's the low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, I'll jump in and say, Los Angeles is truly amazing. And you said it at the beginning, Amber. I'm actually coming to you from my office in Ann Arbor at the moment, but I know where Los Angeles is, and I've been there a few times, and I know it's really big. I mean, it's monstrous. I originally came from Canada, where when I was growing up, the population of the whole country was 25 million people. And if I'm not mistaken, the population of greater Los Angeles is probably approaching 15 to 18 million. Does that sound about right? People are nodding. So that's the entirety of the whole country I lived in almost as a child, concentrated in one place. So that to me is, number one, extraordinarily challenging, both because it requires really amazing collaboration across all kinds of people to get things done. It's an amazing opportunity to really put into practice a lot of the things that we're talking about in society today with respect to diversity, equity, inclusion, justice. We can't address the big sustainability challenges of our day if we don't address those challenges. And what better place than Los Angeles to make that real? And then when I think about Los Angeles in terms of everything that's happening, from industry to finance to citizens doing all the things that citizens do, it's an enormous living laboratory where we can test things out. So opportunities to build units that would sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert that raw carbon into polymers, into cement, into other kinds of materials, fuels, synfuels, that can be used by society to keep it moving forward without having to draw on natural resources. A place with 18 million people is a unique test bed to do that. It's a unique test bed to try out new ideas around transportation and mobility and commuting and public transportation. It's a great place to try out new ways to build more climate resilient infrastructure on coastlines, in mountainous areas where people are abutting up against forested regions. So to me, it's a little bit scary because it's real. These are real people living real lives, and you want to do it right. But at the same time, to know how to do it right, you got to try it out. And I think this is a gold mine in terms of not only being the firewall for the world in terms of kind of staving off a lot of climate-related and sustainability-related challenges. It's also a tremendous laboratory where we can really innovate.
Cities in general have a lot of power to make change on sustainability issues because the majority of people in the United States live in cities. And so if cities make choices, no matter what anywhere else in the government is doing, no matter what a state is doing or the federal government is doing, cities can make their own choices that would have a huge impact on sustainability. So things like building codes, zoning codes, making choices about where you're going to buy your energy from, can actually lock in a lot of changes that then won't depend on people fighting in their house about who turned the light on and off, right? And so I think that's where the cities have a lot of power and need to put a lot of their focus.
When we talk about environment and sustainability, often induces cringes, and that's when you introduce the idea of business and industry as playing a role, as not just a part of the challenge, but in many cases as part of the solution to the sustainability challenges that we're talking about, climate change being one. We can talk about lots of examples of particular industries that have done particular things to be more of a solution than a problem. But one thing that I think business doesn't get enough credit for, that I think has been adopted in places like California, in cities like Los Angeles, and then in other large and populous states like New York and cities like New York City, is the way in which these places are run is very much like a business. So they recognize that there's a need to make decisions based on data. It's not just sort of knee-jerk stuff. It's very kind of pre-planned. There's a lot of R&D and thinking that goes into designing, just like products and industry, policies and programs within a government, like in Los Angeles at the city level, or California at the state level. And there's a lot of calculus that goes into being the first mover. There is often a first mover advantage but if it's really well thought out and well reasoned. And I think in the case of California and the case of Los Angeles, a lot of those first mover opportunities that the state and the cities have seized upon are ones where they're really well reasoned, really well thought out, where the return on those investments is projected to be fairly large. And we're seeing this week now with the state of California talking about no longer selling vehicles with combustion engines in 2035. A lot of people kind of gasped and kind of worried about their futures and their cars' futures, 15 years from today. But the reality is, by being the first mover on that front, LA is getting out and California is getting it out ahead of a curve that's going to hit everyone else probably within 1, 2, 3, or 4 years. So the fact that we can get, as a state, a head start on that is enormously important from the standpoint of the state remaining competitive, not only as a driving economic force in the country, but as an exemplar for economies and policymakers around the world.
But talking about the free market and the role of business, and this is such an important space, and we haven't really even talked about that yet. I know this is very much Matt's bailiwick, but others may have thoughts too. How do we work with the business community?
Amber, in the book I'm going to be publishing soon, two very talented Dornsife undergraduates, Brian Casey and Nolan Jones, wrote the farming chapter with me, and they taught me about vertical farming. And at first I thought we were doing hippie stuff, and they said, "Professor, you don't know what you're talking about." They taught me about the profits to be earned in vertical farming and how it may become even more profitable in a world where there's drought and where there's extreme climate conditions. And so something I want our environmental economics Department of Economics at Dornsife thinking about is, what are new opportunities for firms who see the climate science as they learn from the Wrigley Institute, of what are new opportunities that arise. So what's the next Tesla out there that, for better or worse, if we face more risk from climate change, this creates enormous opportunities for firms that can create solutions. And my mother says, "Matthew, don't believe in magic." I do believe in incentives, and I do believe that more people are seeing the threat we face. But I am an optimist about the potential for businesses to innovate. And I think Joe and I can have a good debate there about which firms are asleep at the wheel versus which firms are awake. And will those firms that are awake and scared, will they win the competition? And so there's many interesting issues at the interface of economics, business, and psychology about whether competition among businesses drives green innovation.
It has to, right? Does anyone argue it doesn't?
I don't want to monopolize the conversation because, Jill and Wendy probably have just as much to say about this as I do, but I think Matthew's hitting on something crucially important. I think that the big innovators in business and in the private sector in the sustainability world are making great strides simply because they are producing tremendously good products. If you can produce really good stuff and make it sustainable, I think that's the magic. That's really how you piece things together. Paul Pullman, former CEO of Unilever, was famous for this. He doesn't want to make good environmentally friendly products. He wants to make great products that are also environmentally friendly. And that is I think, really something to be striving for.
And I think in terms of public perceptions, that's where we have some work to do, because it turns out that for some products, people perceive the green product to be less good or less effective.
What are you guys seeing in the reactions of younger people to these kinds of things?
I'll jump in and say a couple of things. One is that, we just finished an experiment not that long ago where we looked at how millennials look at a wide range of environmental challenges and compared their concern level, but also their willingness to support policy to address those challenges with other age categories, with Gen Xers, with baby boomers, with people going up as far as the silent generation. And what we found there is that when we actually control for age, young people aren't actually more motivated to protect the environment and don't care that much more about the environment. What it comes down to are a lot of the cultural worldviews that tend to be more prominent amongst young people, but that are also present in older generations. So from a marketing standpoint, I think, Amber, you're kind of nailing it, is that we have to get away from things that we kind of viscerally think ought to make a difference, marketing to young people, marketing to greens, and really get into understanding that human nature and human behavior is really a composite of kind of cultural and kind of attitudinal variables that are what really drive how we think and behave.
In economics classes, there can be sometimes philosophical debates, and there can sometimes be cases. The students have a Rawlsian perspective that many of our students care very, very, very much about how any policy change affects the poor. And so if we're discussing something like banning plastic bags, some very interesting discussions in an economics class, which often talks about unintended consequences, can veer into, well, how are the poor going to get their stuff home? And this interests me. And so the young people in my environmental economics classes are both very passionate about social justice and about protecting the environment. There's a little bit of cynicism as I root for economic growth that they say, Professor, that's just going to make Jeff Bezos richer. And so we have some very spirited debates in class, and I respectfully listen to our very talented students. And I think that I've earned their trust that we can have some friendly debates about some sensitive issues.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's getting harder and harder in the real world. You know, we haven't talked about the political divide that this just invites us to talk about. It's gotten so contentious and so difficult to talk about this across the aisle. Some of our listeners may be aware of our Center for the Political Future that we launched a couple of years ago, co-led by Democratic strategist Bob Shrum and Republican strategist Mike Murphy. And the whole goal there is to get people really debating some of these very, very difficult issues across the aisle in a way that's civil and respectful and, you know, starts with the facts, but then really hashes it out on the different sides. I know several of you worked in, I know, Joe, you're advising one politician at the moment, and I know others of you have thought about this. How do we work on this problem across the aisle?
So actually, climate change is not the only thing in the topic in which there is a lot of political polarization. COVID responses also, and yeah. Anyway, so a recommendation from the field of communication is that if you want to promote a shared response, it's important to focus on those things that unites us, and we're all people, and we're all human, and have, for example, a need for breathable air. We probably all care about our health and health of our children and the next generation, and so, but these things are affected by climate change, and so perhaps the focus should be more on the outcomes that people care about, and less on the abstract notion of climate change.
Yeah, and along those lines, you know, it seems like we shouldn't even have to say it, but a lot of the policies that get developed in government, whether it's at the city level, the state level, or the federal level, really need to be evidence-based. And by evidence-based, what we mean is understanding of the nature of the challenges that lead to the need for policy in the first place. Evidence-based in that they respond to the concerns of constituencies and citizens who are being affected by those challenges. And then evidence-based in the sense that whatever policies are being developed and then ultimately put in place are the ones that stand the best chance of addressing the concerns that were articulated in the earlier stages of policy development. And it's really amazing to me that that rarely actually happens for reasons that I think everyone here has talked about, these big kind of partisan battles where we retreat to our tribes and don't really engage as critically as we might want to, or as we might need to when it comes to policies and what they're going to do. So if you think about just something like the transition to renewable energy, the first thing to realize is that in a lot of jurisdictions around the state and around the country, you just can't convert everything to solar or to wind. You have to have backstops in terms of providing reliable backup sources of energy. A lot of communities are combined heat and power. So in addition to generating electricity, you need to generate steam. Steam requires heat, which requires burning something usually. And therefore, you've got these really interesting dynamics around, it's not just one technology that's going to be the solution, but it's going to be a portfolio of technologies. And then you layer on top of that that the individual technologies have differential effects on air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, land use, job creation. They cost different amounts of money. So now the trick for a policymaker is to work with experts like the ones on the screen today to be able to identify the policies that are going to do the most for the most, do the most across those matters of concern, do the most in terms of hitting on those things that we care about, doing the most in terms of kind of being the right blend of technologies that we can ultimately deploy. And in research in our lab, people's ability to sort of get that kind of calculus right is not great. In fact, if you looked at, I'll use an example of 6 different options that one could choose from. If you rolled a dice, it would actually almost be better at picking the alternative that was in line with your values than you actually looking at the data and trying to pick it yourself. And that's not because people aren't paying attention. It's not because they lack education. It's because making those kind of multi-attribute decisions is actually extraordinarily challenging.
I just want to add something on a slightly different dimension, but that goes off of what Joe was saying about values. If you want to get somebody to come along with some sort of policy change that you want, I think you need to understand what their values are and appeal to those specifically. So we've mentioned climate change a lot. I just want to say that sustainability is a lot more than climate change, but I'm going to use a climate example here. That if you're trying to get some people to support a change from coal-fired power plants to renewable energy, it might be a good idea to understand if they are concerned about economic effects. And you might want to tell them that in most cases these days, renewable energy is actually cheaper than coal-fired power plant energy. Or if they were concerned about energy security and the fact that we get energy from other countries, renewable energy belongs to the United States if it's built here, right? So appealing to those specific values and not really necessarily caring about whether or not you've convinced a person that it matters to fix climate change, I think is something that we need to consider.
What do our students need? What does this generation of students need to be leaving college with? To go out in the world, specifically to be thinking about the kinds of careers that are going to be, I think about when we were kids, I think most of us sort of imagined we'd have one career, and the kids we're preparing today are going to have probably multiple careers. Most of them are going to evolve not just multiple jobs, but multiple careers. And we've thought a lot in general about how do we prepare our undergraduates for that kind of a world. And in this particular context where we imagine a greener set of jobs and changing economies and things that are different, how are you as teachers thinking about making sure that your students are leaving with the right set of skills? Who wants to dive in?
I guess I'll jump in first. We really try to balance the idea that the students do need a set of skills to do work when they leave USC, with the idea that new skills can always be acquired throughout your life, but the ability to think is something that's going to be universal across all kinds of careers. So from a sustainability perspective, if you're trying to be able to solve sustainability problems, you need to have that ability to see the world as a system, which Joe mentioned before. And I'm not just talking about the natural world, but the people and the economy, they're all part of a system where if you make a change in one place, you're going to see a consequence in another place. And being able to anticipate what those changes might be so that as you're coming up with solutions for a particular problem in sustainability, that you can come up with an ethical solution that is fair and equitable for people of different nations and different races and ethnicities.
So if there's one thing that I think all of us are doing, is it's teaching people, whether they're undergraduate students, graduate students, but in many cases now, people coming back for professional or executive development, to kind of open up the manual on themselves and learn about how they work so that some of the obstacles and biases that they might be falling back on when they make decisions about not just sustainability, but all kinds of things, that those kinds of biases might be avoided in the future.
I think that's a terrific place to close. Thank you so much, all of you, for participating today, and thank all of you for coming and joining us. Have a nice evening, and thanks again for coming to Trojan Family Weekend 2020.